First of all, we would like to introduce you the project from a more organizational point of view. Funding is provided by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, the BMBF, and the state of Hesse within the funding program Innovative Hochschule. The Darmstadt University of Applied Sciences receives funding for the transfer project SNE, System Innovation for Sustainable Development, with the aim of establishing regional transfer structures. It is a rather large project. As you can see, we are talking about a total volume of around 10 million euros if one includes all the partners from the region. At least 56 people are working together. However, not all of them are in the leather project, but they are in other projects affiliated, for example, on climate issues in the urban context or on the circular economy, which are not subject of this webinar today. Of course, there's still a stimulating exchange between all these projects. Furthermore, SNE, the project offers structures and resources that our leather project can access. For example, there's the citizens panel, which in the month of May surveyed consumers on our behalf on the issue of chemicals in leather. I'm sorry, Karen, I forgot to mention that you please show the next slide. Thank you. The circle in the top middle shows the expertise of the people who work mainly in the leather project, namely chemistry and biotechnology, design, law, economics, and environmental engineering. And the practice partners from the region that are active in the leather project are also shown. The university can already draw from numerous relevant projects and preparatory work, especially in the context of more sustainable chemistry. And what this means, for example, for chemicals management in the supply chains, such as for textile articles. And we are also involved in the fields of chemical policy, for example, through research work and consulting we are doing for the European Commission and German authorities and ministries. Finally, I'd like to emphasize the duration of the project. As you can see, we are at the halfway point and can therefore use all the resources I have just mentioned for at least another 2.5 years. Next slide, please. So now we move on to the presentation of the project in terms of the contents. Concerning the challenges that the leather industry is facing, it is worth taking a look at the Sustainable Development Goals, to which the United Nations have politically committed themselves in a resolution in September 2015. Many SDGs have concrete reference points to the leather industry, and many of these reference points, you can say, flow together in Sustainable Development Goal 12 on sustainable consumption and production patterns. And within SDG 12, there's one target which aims to achieve by 2020 the environmentally sound management of chemicals and all wastes throughout their life cycle. For our purposes in the project, we translate this as the goal of a more sustainable chemistry with a view to the environment and the living beings in it, such as humans. In other words, we are talking about a chemistry that does not harm people and the environment because of the intrinsic toxicity, and which also in a broader sense conserves natural resources. Next slide, please. Measured against this, we are not yet dealing with more sustainable leather chemistry everywhere in 2020. This photo shows employees in a tannery without any protective clothing, and we spare ourselves the images of children up to their knees in water contaminated with tanning agents or of rivers into which tannery waste has been discharged untreated. Such a photo, which could have been taken in South Asia, for example, is in no way representative of the leather industry as a whole. We are quite aware of that. However, this is one of the connotations that people, for example, consumers or politicians, are linking with the leather industry. And this is where the work of NGOs comes into play, and of critical journalists and of media stations who broadcast critical reports about the grievances in production countries on television at prime time, at least in Germany, that is the case. The focus here is usually on risks to humans and the environment. And the problem zones can usually be clearly located in third countries where comparatively low standards of protection for workers and the environment apply. However, if we follow this supply chain downstream, it is sometimes a Western brand or retailer for whom these tanneries produce. And of course, everyone knows that especially in the mass market, there's a high price pressure. Production takes thus place where this is possible under cost-effective conditions, or in other words, because low standard supply. If the standards reach a higher level due to societal accomplishments, production simply shifts to other locations where it is possible to produce under the usual cheaper conditions. Yet, the value creation of leather products is subject to global networks. You may have a click also, Karin. And I think it is fair to say that the reputation of the entire industry is affected. That means also the reputation of those supply chain actors who produce to very high standards using modern, environmentally friendly production technologies. And other aspects certainly play a role in the loss of image, such as animal welfare and deforestation, for examples. Nevertheless, it is certainly not too much to say that the issue of chemicals in leather is becoming more and more important for the societies. Next slide, please. Chemicals in leather also have their relevance for consumer protection. Probably the most prominent example in this context is, of course, the repeated official RAPEX warnings and more or less voluntary recalls of leather goods with increased chromium-6 values. In the EU, these products are therefore not marketable because they violate legal requirements of the REACH regulation. But there are also bans in force on certain dyes, for example. The topic chemicals in leather is therefore also relevant for legal compliance. In Europe, further REACH restrictions are currently under preparation, including specifically with regard to leather, a substance group-based approach to ban up to more than 1,000 substances that have a sensitizing effect on the skin. And of course, in other regions, such as North America, in China, in Korea, in Turkey, chemical bans are in force as well. In addition, the EU's chemical policy activities in the context of the new Green Deal and this year's circular economy package are providing strong normative impetus, at least for the European region. And also, the EU is preparing a chemical strategy for sustainability, which is expected in the fall of 2020. In summary, the leather industry is facing the challenge of how to ensure legal compliance in the face of complex production value chains. And the sector needs to find answers on how it can better assume its social responsibility and even generate market opportunities in a dynamic legal environment. Next slide, please. Yeah, so against this background, the aim of our project is to help industry make the transition to more sustainable leather chemistry. And at this point, I'd like to mention or even highlight our independent position as a research organization, because by definition, we are only committed to the goal of sustainable development. Next slide, please. Okay, for starters, how do you now transform a global supply chain? Companies or the people working in them look at problems from the perspective of their individual processes. They also see solutions from this perspective, but individual solutions reach their limits, so you need other actors. But the other actors, of course, have a different perspective. So the consequence is that together they can only take small steps and remain in eternal negotiation processes. In the leather context, the initial situation can be outlined as followed, in a very reductionist way, I admit, that on the one side, there are suppliers, and they say that brands and retail should procure more high quality materials. For instance, chemicals that are listed in the ZTHC Chemicals Gateway, or leather materials that have been audited by the Leather Working Group. On the other side, we have the brands saying that such procurement is simply too expensive in the price fight for the attention of the consumer, and in particular in the case of business models geared at the mass market. So the result is a deadlocked situation, and the actors are not making much progress. Next slide, please. Now, if you want to get out of this blockade, a system perspective or a big picture is needed. Because from a big picture perspective, you can develop the best solutions for all players. In other words, the leather industry has to develop a system view or a system picture to understand the challenges and identify the possible solutions. And at a workshop in 2018, the Darmstadt University of Applied Sciences proposed the scenario technique for this, a method developed by Horst Geschke at the Bartel Institute. And the actors from the leather chains and other stakeholders present at the workshop said, okay, let's try that. And so we subsequently organized the scenario process, which I will introduce to you in the following slides. Yeah, here you can see an overview of all process steps. I just want to make the point that the scenario process was carried out within 3 months in 2019, after quite some preparation. And the milestones basically were 3 full-day workshops with the experts. Next slide, please. At the aforementioned workshop in 2018, we already discussed the composition of the scenario group with the practitioners. The challenge here is to invite not too few, but also not too many experts. So we decided to model a supply chain that covers several fields of leather application, as you can see in red on the right side. Through other stakeholders, we have obtained expertise on local conditions in third countries, as you can see in the left. And within the frame, you can see the organizations that have kindly sent their experts. These experts have developed the scenario stories with the help of our project and the management consultancy Geschke. At the same time, I would like to make clear that then and now, of course, we are in exchange with many more actors. The basis of our networking activity is actor mapping that we had done at the beginning of the project. And just so you get the idea, we have added as examples some logos of organizations we are in contact with as well. But please note that these organizations did not participate in the scenario process. Next slide, please. The first step in this process is to define the actual subject issue as a reference point for all further steps. I would like to simply quote this. The subject was Leather 2035, use of chemicals in the global supply chains in the production of leather for consumer goods and automotive applications, including functionalized standard goods. Next slide, please. Subsequently, the factors that will have an impact on the above-mentioned subject topic in 2035 were to be identified. We have collected in a workshop about 100 to 150 factors and condensed those to the 16 most relevant factors. Those were in the next step to be evaluated. Guiding questions were, what are driving and driven factors? Or how strongly are the factors interlinked? To answer these questions, the participants enter into a moderated dialogue and negotiation process, which is called relational impact analysis of the influencing factors. Next slide, please. The relational impact analysis of the influencing factors is a core element of the scenario process. For this purpose, an impact matrix is filled, as shown here. You see the same 16 influencing factors in the rows and columns. The question now is how strongly these interact. And this is indicated by a numerical value from 0 to 3. In order to find this value, the participants are simply discussing. And this may already enable the change of perspective for participants, especially because the same two factors always meet twice. For example, one does not only ask how the critical public affects production costs, but also vice versa, how production costs affect the critical public. And so every relationship of effects is thus viewed from two perspectives. Then a number is entered in each box. The line total provides a measure of the influence that one factor has on the entire system of factors. And the column sum provides a measure of the influence that the system of factors has on this particular factor. And if you now calculate the quotient from this, you obtain a particular value to indicate whether a factor is driving, whether it's driven, or whether it's a so-called critical factor, which can be both, depending on the context. I'll give you some examples for driving factors according to our analysis. Those have been requirements concerning functionality of leather, the regulatory framework or the missing regulatory framework, and traceability. Among the driving factors have been production cost and process innovation. And other critical factors included the quality of rawhides and the availability of means of production. And consumer, by the way, or consumer behavior stands somewhere between the driven factors and the critical factors that can be driven or drivers depending on the context. So what can we learn from this? The figures cannot be compared with metrics like grams or parts per million. Rather, they represent relationships, no more and no less. But it gives a very good overall impression of what the driving factors are, underpinned by a very fruitful discussion, which is not entirely reflected by this single value. So you could also say that these drivers are leverage points with a view to a more sustainable leather chemistry. And that is where the industry should start. And this is also what is taken into account in the next process steps. So please, next slide. Thanks. In the second workshop, the participants develop projections for each influencing factor. Starting with a brief description of the status quo, usually two more or less probable versions of how this factor could have changed in 2035 were considered. Next slide, please. And these projections can be brought into almost infinite combinations. The goal of the consistency analysis was thus to identify coherent combinations of projections. The software helps to do this. Based on this data, we selected two combinations, which are, on the one hand, very different from each other, and on the other hand, which are each characterized by a high internal consistency. Next slide, please. And based on this, the participants developed scenario stories in a very creative team process. The aim was to create a convincing story through the logical connection and right sequence of factors. Participants also had to add some emotion to the stories by using pictures, emojis, and the like, so that strong narratives could be created. Please, the next slide. And then finally, the narratives could be transferred to the text form. The two stories that have been developed are very different. In the mass instead of class scenario, there are at best incremental improvements, while in 2035 the industry faces similar challenges as it does today. In contrast, the second scenario, quality through appreciation and awareness, describes a much more positive development in the course of which the industry has succeeded in tackling and mastering the challenges. And the participants have chosen this latter positive scenario as their vision to which they are trying to commit to. At the same time, they have made clear that this scenario will require massive changes in behavior for mass market actors in particular. Next slide, please. I would now like to outline this vision very roughly. You see increased transparency and knowledge along the supply chains on chemicals and processes and products plays a key role in this scenario. And this has been made possible by creating structures within the supply chains and through horizontal and vertical cooperation to ensure traceability of chemicals along the supply chain. Brands and retailers were able to pass on transparency gains to their customers, thus changing the awareness of consumers and their willingness to pay. Brands and retail, in turn, now had the opportunities to send a more specific demand for more sustainable chemistry into their supply chains. And this, in turn, created incentives for suppliers to even more innovate into processes and products. It can also be said that business models oriented at more sustainable leather chemistry along the supply chain suddenly paid more off. Two other developments are crucial that I would like to explain. On the one hand, the framework conditions in the supplier countries have changed because society no longer accepted the negative effects of production on people and the environment. And in turn, also the political agendas at these locations put more emphasis on sustainability. In parallel, there were legal impulses in the consumer countries, like a dynamic development of chemicals legislation in particular. And these developments provide the necessary impetus to supply chains to set up suitable chemicals management structures. And this brings us back to the topics of transparency and traceability. I hope that I have managed to explain the vision of the project to you in a comprehensible way. My colleague Jonas will now outline the subsequent steps, meaning how the project has derived from this vision, strategies and concrete measures.